April 11th, 1942. Off Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan stood on the conning tower of U-123, watching the tanker SS Gulf America burn 5 miles from shore. Through his Zeiss binoculars, he could see automobile headlights streaming toward the beach as Americans rushed to witness the spectacle. In his war diary, he wrote, "All the vacationers had seen an impressive special performance at Roosevelt's expense. A burning tanker, artillery fire, the silhouette of a U-boat. How often had that been seen in America?" The crew below deck celebrated. They had just demonstrated German naval superiority in American waters, sinking their 19th ship of the war. What none of them knew was that they were witnessing the final weeks of easy hunting, that American shipyards were already accelerating production of vessels that would flood the Atlantic in numbers beyond German comprehension. 2,710 Liberty ships built in just 4 years, emerging from assembly lines at rates that would transform submarine warfare from hunting to being hunted. The transformation was already underway in American shipyards, though no U-boat commander could have imagined the scale. While Hardigan celebrated his successes during what Germans called the Second Happy Time, American shipyards were preparing to launch ships faster than U-boats could reload their torpedo tubes. The vessels they dismissed as inferior would soon cross the Atlantic in convoys so large that attacking them would mean certain death for submarines. January 12, 1942, had marked the opening of Operation Drumbeat, when German U-boats brought the Battle of the Atlantic to American shores. 5 Type 9 submarines, the only boats with sufficient range to reach American waters without refueling, had crossed the Atlantic under strict radio silence. Their mission was to deliver a devastating blow to American morale and shipping. The first kill came quickly. U-123 under Hardigan torpedoed the British freighter Cyclops 300 miles southeast of Cape Sable, Nova Scotia. The 9,076-ton vessel went down with 98 of her 181 souls aboard. It was the beginning of what Admiral Karl Dönitz hoped would strangle American supply lines before they could fully mobilize for war. What the U-boats found exceeded their expectations. Despite British warnings and the experience of 2 years of submarine warfare in the Atlantic, the American coast remained unprepared. Ships sailed independently without escorts. Coastal cities refused to implement blackouts, with Miami and Atlantic City arguing it would destroy tourism revenue. Navigation lights and buoys operated normally. Merchant vessels followed predictable peacetime routes. By February 6, 1942, when the first wave of Operation Drumbeat ended, the 5 U-boats had sunk 25 ships totaling 156,939 tons. Hardigan alone in U-123 accounted for 9 ships and 53,173 tons. The success seemed to validate everything German naval strategists believed about American weakness. Admiral Adolphus Andrews, commanding the eastern sea frontier from Maine to Florida, possessed exactly 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 World War I-era destroyers, and no aircraft equipped for anti-submarine warfare. He received detailed intelligence from the British about U-boat positions, but lacked resources to respond. When British naval officials recommended implementing coastal convoys based on their experience, Admiral Ernest King initially resisted, believing convoys would simply group targets together for U-boats. The U-boat commanders interpreted this lack of defense as evidence of American incompetence. They did not realize it reflected confidence in industrial capacity beyond their comprehension. Even as ships burned along the eastern seaboard, American shipyards were implementing mass production techniques that would revolutionize shipbuilding. The first Liberty ship, SS Patrick Henry, had been launched on September 27, 1941, after 244 days of construction. By 1943, the average construction time would drop to 42 days. At peak efficiency, Richmond Shipyard number. 2 in California would launch the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, though this was a publicity stunt that demonstrated capability rather than standard practice. The transformation began with Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before 1940. Kaiser applied automobile assembly line techniques to shipbuilding. Instead of constructing ships from the keel up in sequence, workers prefabricated massive sections in workshops, then assembled them using welding instead of riveting. This reduced construction time by 2/3 and allowed the use of workers with minimal training. German U-boat construction followed traditional methods, requiring skilled craftsmen and 10 to 12 months per submarine. German shipyards managed to produce approximately 20 U-boats monthly at peak production. Meanwhile, American shipyards would launch 1,238 Liberty ships in 1943 alone, more than 3 per day. The tide began turning in May 1942 when the United States finally implemented coastal convoys. Sinkings immediately dropped from 23 ships in April to 4 in May within the eastern sea frontier. U-boats found their hunting grounds suddenly empty. Ships that had sailed independently now moved in protected groups with air cover. Admiral Dönitz shifted his submarines south to the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, where defences remained weak. In May 1942, U-507 under Korvettenkapitän Harro Schacht became the first U-boat to enter the Gulf of Mexico, sinking the freighter Norlindo on May 4th. For several months, U-boats found new hunting grounds, sinking 115 ships in May alone, but the respite was temporary. By July 1942, the convoy system extended throughout American waters. The US Navy had finally accepted what the British had learned through bitter experience, that even weakly escorted convoys were safer than ships sailing independently. Monthly sinkings in the Gulf of Mexico dropped from 41 ships in June to 4 in July after convoys were implemented. The production statistics told a story the German High Command struggled to accept. In 1942, American shipyards launched 646 ships, totaling over 5 million tons. 597 of these were Liberty ships. The following year would see even greater production, 1,238 Liberty ships totaling over 11 million tons. Admiral Dönitz had calculated that U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons monthly to defeat Britain. After America entered the war, this figure rose to 1.3 million tons monthly. The highest monthly toll U-boats ever achieved was November 1942 at 729,000 tons. That same month, American shipyards launched over 1 million tons of new shipping. By March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its decisive phase. The largest convoy battles of the war occurred when wolf packs attacked convoys HX-229 and SC-122. 40 U-boats concentrated against 90 merchant ships in a running battle lasting 4 days. The U-boats sank 22 ships totaling 146,000 tons, seemingly a great victory. Yet the numbers revealed a different reality. While celebrating their success, U-boat commanders didn't know that American shipyards had launched 240,000 tons of shipping the same week. The convoys, despite losses, still delivered approximately 800,000 tons of supplies to Britain. 7 U-boats were lost in the battle, including experienced crews that couldn't be replaced. The tonnage war had turned decisively against Germany. Where once a single U-boat might sink 100,000 tons in a patrol, by 1943 the average per patrol had dropped to less than 20,000 tons. Meanwhile, U-boat losses increased dramatically as Allied escorts gained experience and new weapons. May 1943 became known as Black May in the U-boat force. 43 U-boats were lost, 25% of the operational fleet, while sinking only 34 merchant ships. The exchange rate that had once favoured submarines by 50 to 1 had reversed to nearly even. On May 24th, Admiral Dönitz withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic, effectively conceding defeat. The defeat wasn't just tactical, but industrial. In 1943 alone, the United States launched ships totaling 19.3 million tons. The entire German U-boat force, operating at maximum capacity, had managed to sink 3.6 million tons worldwide, less than 20% of American production alone. Korvettenkapitän Werner Henke, commanding U-515, achieved one of the last major U-boat successes when he attacked convoy TS-37 off West Africa on April 30, 1943. In 12 hours, he sank 7 ships totaling 49,456 tons. It seemed like the glory days had returned. Yet Henke knew the truth. He had expended most of his torpedoes and endured hundreds of depth charges to achieve what had once been routine. Within a year, he would be dead, shot while attempting to escape from an American prisoner of war camp. The Liberty ships that U-boat commanders initially dismissed proved remarkably resilient. Yes, some suffered from brittle fracture in cold water, a problem with early welding techniques and steel quality. 12 Liberty ships broke in half, including 3 that sank, but 2,698 others completed millions of miles of wartime service. The simple design that U-boat officers ridiculed allowed rapid damage control and repair. American shipyards weren't just building Liberty ships. The Maritime Commission oversaw construction of T-2 tankers, Victory ships, and hundreds of other vessel types. By 1943, American shipyards employed hundreds of thousands of workers, including many women and minorities previously excluded from industrial work. The technological gap widened rapidly. Liberty ships began carrying radar that could detect surfaced U-boats at night. High-frequency direction finders pinpointed submarines transmitting radio messages. Some Liberty ships were converted to escort carriers, bringing aircraft to mid-ocean where U-boats had once operated safely. The U-boats attempted to counter with new technology. The Type 21 submarine, with high underwater speed and sophisticated sensors, promised to restore German advantage. But only 4 became operational before war's end. Germany built 118 Type 21s. America built those 2,710 Liberty ships. By late 1943, crossing the Atlantic as a U-boat meant probable death. The submarine that had been predator became prey. Convoys now hunted U-boats with coordinated surface and air attacks. Escort carriers launched aircraft that caught U-boats on the surface, recharging batteries. The Bay of Biscay, through which U-boats had to pass leaving French ports, became known among German submariners as the Valley of Death. U-boat crews understood the statistics. In 1942, a submarine had a 75% chance of returning from patrol. By 1944, the odds reversed. Most boats never returned. Of 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were lost. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats, 30,000 died, a casualty rate of 75%. The Liberty ships continued launching even as U-boats disappeared from the seas. Richmond Shipyard No. 2 alone built 489 Liberty ships, more than half the entire U-boat fleet commissioned during the war. 18 American shipyards built Liberty ships, while Germany struggled to maintain 5 U-boat construction yards under constant Allied bombing. Admiral Dönitz understood the arithmetic, but couldn't accept defeat. In his war diary for April 1943, he wrote, "The enemy power's new construction far exceeds the losses of tonnage we are able to inflict. The enemy has succeeded in building cargo vessels on an assembly line system. Yet he continued sending U-boats to certain death, believing determination could overcome industrial reality. The crews knew better." When U-230 returned from patrol in late 1943, one of the few to do so, crew member Herbert Werner later wrote in his memoir Iron Coffins about the transformation he witnessed. Where once the ocean had been their hunting ground, now every convoy bristled with escorts and aircraft. The hunters had become the hunted. American production never slowed. Even after Germany's surrender in May 1945, Liberty ships continued launching to support the Pacific War. The final Liberty ship, SS Albert M. Bow, was delivered on October 30, 1945. By then, U-boats existed only as rusting hulks in defeated ports or wreckage on the ocean floor. The numbers tell the complete story. Germany built 1,162 U-boats during World War II. The United States alone built 2,710 Liberty ships, plus 531 Victory ships, plus 490 T-2 tankers, plus thousands of other vessels. For every U-boat that entered service, America launched more than 2 Liberty ships alone. In January 1942, 5 U-boats had terrorized the American coast, sinking ships within sight of beach resorts. By January 1945, those same waters saw hundreds of Liberty ships sailing safely while surviving U-boats huddled in bunkers, waiting for a miracle that wouldn't come. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won by warships or aircraft alone. It was won in shipyards where workers who had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor learned to weld and rivet. It was won by industrialists who applied assembly line techniques to shipbuilding. It was won by a nation that could build ships faster than an enemy could sink them. The 18 American shipyards that built Liberty ships employed diverse workforces that transformed American society. Women comprised up to 20% of shipyard workers by 1943. African Americans, previously excluded from skilled industrial work, became welders and riveters. The ships they built outlasted the entire German Kriegsmarine. The psychological transformation in the U-boat force was complete by 1944. Where once they had sailed as elite volunteers confident in victory, now they departed knowing they faced probable death. The grey wolves who had terrorized the Atlantic became, in the words of one survivor, sailors trapped in iron coffins. Some Liberty ships served for decades after the war. The SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien survive as museum ships, testament to American industrial mobilization. They outlasted the entire Kriegsmarine, proof that sufficient quantity becomes its own quality in modern warfare. The U-boat force that had nearly starved Britain in 1942 was buried under American steel. Not the steel of warships alone, but of cargo vessels built in such numbers that losing dozens meant nothing. The Liberty ships became symbols of Allied victory through mass production. Admiral Dönitz surrendered on May 7, 1945, signing documents while thousands of Liberty ships still sailed the world's oceans. In his final message to the U-boat force on May 4th, he acknowledged reality. "You have fought like lions. A crushing material superiority has forced us into a narrow area." That superiority was measured in merchant ships. Where U-boats had sunk one, 3 more appeared. Where submarines had cleared a sea lane, convoys of 50 to 60 ships filled it. Where Germany had built a U-boat, America had built multiple merchant vessels, plus the warships to protect them. The final accounting was stark. U-boats sank approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships, totaling 14.5 million tons during the war. The Allies, led by American production, built over 42 million tons of shipping during the same period. The replacement rate exceeded 290%. Once American shipyards reached full production, it was never truly a contest. The transformation from January 1942 to May 1945 was complete. The U-boat force that had arrived confident of victory was destroyed by industrial production they had dismissed as inferior. Liberty ships carried the arsenal of democracy across every ocean, supplied every battlefront, and proved that in modern war production capacity determines victory. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardigan, who had opened Operation Drumbeat with such confidence, survived the war. In a 1990 interview with historian Michael Gannon, he acknowledged what had been unthinkable in 1942, that Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. The U-boats had won battles but lost the war to American shipyards. The last German U-boat to surrender, U-977, did so in Argentina on August 17, 1945. By then, those 2,710 Liberty ships had been built, with more still under construction for post-war needs. The submarines that had ruled the Atlantic in 1942 were extinct, while the ships they had dismissed would sail for decades more. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately decided in American shipyards. Every welded seam, every prefabricated section, every launched Liberty ship represented industrial might that no amount of submarine warfare could overcome. German submariners learned that when a nation can replace ships faster than enemies can sink them, victory becomes inevitable. The Liberty ships weren't beautiful. They weren't fast. They weren't sophisticated. But there were 2,710 of them, and that was more than enough. They represented American industrial capacity unleashed, the production line defeating the battle line. The U-boat captains had dismissed Liberty ships until those ships, through sheer numbers, made submarine warfare obsolete. In his memoirs published in 1958, Admiral Dönitz wrote, "The German U-boat campaign was wrecked by the introduction of the convoy system and by the enemy's immense shipbuilding program, especially the Liberty ships, which no U-boat force could have defeated." It was a belated recognition of what American shipyard workers had understood from the beginning, that modern war is won in factories as much as on battlefields. The story of the U-boats versus Liberty ships remains one of history's clearest examples of industrial might determining military outcome. The German submarine force, tactically superior and initially successful, was ultimately overwhelmed not by better submarines or tactics, but by merchant ships built faster than they could be destroyed. The U-boat captains who laughed at American shipbuilding in early 1942 witnessed those same ships transform the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a highway for Allied victory. By war's end, Liberty ships had carried 75% of all American cargo shipped overseas. They had supplied D-Day, sustained Britain, aided the Soviet Union, and helped win the Pacific War. The final irony came in the post-war years. While U-boats became museum pieces and memorials, Liberty ships continued working. Some sailed into the 1960s and 1970s under various flags, carrying the commerce of peace. The ugly ducklings that German naval officers had mocked outlived the entire German submarine fleet by decades. The numbers remain staggering even today. In the time it took Germany to build one U-boat, American shipyards could build 6 Liberty ships. In the time it took to train one U-boat crew, American yards could train hundreds of welders. In the time it took one torpedo to reach its target, another Liberty ship splashed into the water somewhere in America. The German U-boat force entered the war believing in quality over quantity, in the superiority of the warrior over the worker, in tactics over production. They learned, through devastating losses, that American shipyards had made their entire strategy obsolete. The Liberty ships they dismissed in 1942 had, by 1945, carried enough supplies across the Atlantic to ensure Allied victory in Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic ended not with a climactic naval battle, but with the steady, relentless launching of merchant ships from American yards. Each Liberty ship that slid down the ways represented another calculation in the arithmetic of Allied victory. The U-boats that had terrorized the Atlantic were defeated by welders and riveters who never saw the ocean they were helping to conquer. Admiral Dönitz's vision of victory through submarine warfare died in American shipyards. The 300 U-boats he had calculated would win the war were overwhelmed by 2,710 Liberty ships alone, plus thousands more vessels of every type. The tonnage war he had planned to win was lost before it truly began, defeated by American industrial capacity he never fully comprehended. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The Atlantic that had been a killing field for merchant ships in 1942 became a bridge for Allied victory by 1944. The U-boats that had seemed invincible were reduced to futile gestures against an enemy that built ships faster than Germany built torpedoes. The laughter of early 1942 had become the silence of defeat, as Liberty ships continued launching long after the last U-boat had surrendered.